Welcome into another edition of the FCS Football Show. I'm your host, Mid-Major Matt of SportsMemo.com. And as always, joining us on this magic carpet ride is Rob Veno, WagerTalk.com. Rob, how's it going?
Things are good, Matt. A little calmer now with the NCAA dwindling down to their Final Four. So a little bit extra time to look at the FCS this week. And a lot happening in that football division, Matt. Crazy, especially with the COVID outbreak amongst so many conferences here, but they seem to be hanging on. They're going to fight their way through a playoff, so we'll get into it here in a little bit for sure.
Yes, and what we'll do today, as we always do, we'll do a little bit of an intro. We'll talk about three games, then do some last looks towards the end of the show. But I want to start out today, Rob. Yesterday, ironically, during one of the college baseball games in between the innings, they're like, hey, let's just reveal the top 10 for the college football FCS standing to see where some of these teams are. And we've got the clever little graphic for that here. And as expected, or really as not expected necessarily, James Madison's number 1. The Dakotas are 2 and 3. Sam Houston State 4, North Dakota 5, Weber State 6, Delaware 7, VMI 8, UC Davis 9, Murray State 10. Rob, I'll start here, at least from my point of view. JMU has not played for a couple weeks. They did have the game against William & Mary. They haven't really beaten anybody so far. They haven't looked great outside the Tribe game, yet they're still number 1 here. What stuck out to you when you saw this top 10?
Yeah, I think that they could have put these teams, honestly, Matt, in a whole host of orders, and you could have made sense out of them. JMU, I guess because they're unblemished, puts them on top. Most of the other big-time schools have one loss next to their record, but it's going to be the same for North Dakota State, who is now going through coronavirus problems, can't play South Dakota State this week, so that matchup, I think, was postponed to a later date. Weber State certainly got away with one last week, and maybe that penalized them a little bit. I think the two surprises down the bottom, obviously, VMI and Murray State, not accustomed to being in this position. I think I read where for VMI it's been a whole slew of years since they've ever been anywhere near a ranking. So, you got a couple of newcomers and you got a lot of regulars. And what's going to be interesting is when it comes time to actually play these playoff games to see who's ready to play them and who's not, because it's definitely been a staggered season, stop and go type season for the major conferences and all the conferences really across the country.
Yeah, that's for sure. Taking people inside prep for the show, we always write down 3 games, and I think we've gone through like 6 or 7 because a bunch of them were canceled. The JMU Richmond game was canceled. As you mentioned, the Battle of the Dakotas was canceled. There was another game that we were going to do that was also postponed, and we're seeing some of these conferences are canceling the games, some are postponing. I mean, if you're JMU, Rob, JMU technically their season's over right now because Elon next week is not happening either. So now if you're the Dukes, you got to find 1 or 2 games. They're going to try and get the Richmond game rescheduled because, of course, they got both of those games banged so far. So if you're JMU, Rob, you got to find at least 1 more game.
And it's funny, right? Because in FBS football, they made an exemption for Ohio State. There was a certain amount of games that had to be played, and all of a sudden, we don't really have to play that many games. Let's get Ohio State into the play. We just wonder if some rules will be bent here to get the good teams into the playoff, to have the playoff. But you're right, Matt. There's a scramble going on. The Southland hasn't seemed to go through very many problems here. Sam Houston State wins last night. Not as dominant as they've been throughout the season, but certainly a win against Northwestern State on a Saturday night to keep them in good standing. But that conference in particular seemed to go through their season pretty smoothly, other than some of the other ones we're talking about. So maybe come playoff time, Sam Houston State is a squad that has a little bit of an advantage because they've been able to play live football each and every week.
All right, so let's get into our 3 games, and we'll start out mentioning those key bets. VMI is at home as they take on East Tennessee State. East Tennessee State opened as the road favorite, 2 points, 47.5 the total. Flip-flop now. VMI now a 2.5-point favorite. The total still 47.5. And, it's funny because last night I was doing my notes, and it was 1.5, so clearly there's some VMI money coming in. And the name to get to know here is Seth Morgan, replaces Reese Udinsky, who was the tremendous case, the quarterback for VMI, all sorts of record setting. He's transferring to Maryland, but still said he wanted to play with the Keydets. He goes down with an injury, done for the year. Seth Morgan comes in last week, 25 of 34, 375 yards, 4 touchdowns, 76 yards rushing. They win 36-31 over Wofford. Win, and they are in. They get the automatic bid. The East Tennessee State side, they are 3-1. A couple of close wins, 3 wins by 7 points over Samford, Citadel, and Western Carolina. They lost a tough one to Furman at home, 17-13. They have to win, get a loss from VMI, and then get some help next week in order to win the crown. And, of course, the Buccaneers, they run the ball. 350 yards last week against Western Carolina. The Buccaneers, they run the ball. They play good defense. VMI throws the ball, and they're playing surprisingly good defense, Rob.
Yeah, and if we think back, Matt, to the very first week when we did this show, the first live week when VMI, I think, played Furman, and that game ended up 14-13. The total was sky high. And at that point, VMI rattled off a couple of pretty good defensive performances, right? But then that defense has deteriorated somewhat as the offense, they've got a little bit better. The last couple of weeks here, Wofford puts up 440 total yards, 270 on the ground in that game last week. Now they score 24 offensively because one was a kickoff return for a touchdown. The prior week against Samford, 633 total yards allowed, 570 through the air. So just those 2 instances in the last 2 weeks, you see a team that can run the ball, running for 270 on the ground. Looks like VMI's vulnerable. A team that can pass the ball, throws for 570 through the air. So we're wondering right now what VMI defensively can stop East Tennessee State, as you mentioned, not necessarily an overall offensive juggernaut this year. The running game has been good. The running game was relied upon last week. It was a bad weather game. Weather delays, I think a couple at least. But Quay Holmes and the running game took off. And that's another team with a quarterback change, Matt. And perhaps that's the reason behind the line move here, because they just weren't getting any production out of Tyler Riddell. And they wind up going to Brock Landis, a JC transfer last week, whose passing stats were not impressive, 8 of 16. But their head coach said, why would we even throw the ball? It was bad weather and we were running for 350 yards. Quay Holmes had 197. I think it's going to be a task for VMI to stop this particular team. Now, if I go through VMI real quick, other than Furman, they haven't played a real good defense. ETSU qualifies as a Southern Conference real good defense. They've actually had a couple of games here where they held Samford to 17 and held Furman to 17. I think what surprised me most in this game, because I do think that the way VMI is rolling on offense, they're going to be able to move the football. The total here is 47.5. Somewhat surprising to me because I think ETSU is going to find their way. I think they'll be able to develop something on the ground, turn that into at least average production through the air. And on the other side of the field, I just don't know if ETSU can stop the VMI offense at this point in time. They seem to be rolling the way we thought they would roll right from the outset. Last 4 weeks, they've done real well offensively. So to me, 47.5 looks too low. I don't see bad weather in the forecast here. If you're, something in the vicinity of 27, 21 in this game doesn't surprise me at all. So I'll play over 47.5.
So that's a 1:30 kickoff tomorrow here, VMI and East Tennessee State. The opportunity to get VMI into the playoffs is at stake. All right, game number 2. We're usually talking about this matchup when it comes to basketball because usually there's some good players on both sides. But Murray State and Austin Peay as game number 2, 3 o'clock kickoff. Austin Peay about a 2-point favorite. Total opened at 52 and opened at 2. It's up to 3.5 now. Total staying firm at 52. A couple of under leans on the total. But 3.5 is pretty much across the board here. And certainly you look at the Racers, 5-0, 3 single-digit wins. They've got 9 interceptions as a team, which is the second highest total in the FCS. They've allowed 3 sacks all season, so that's good when it comes to running an offense. And then you've got an Austin Peay team coming off a very good win over Jacksonville State, 13-10. They forced 6 turnovers in the game. They're currently, their numbers aren't spectacular, 22.6 points per game, 333 yards per offense, and they're allowing over 30 points per game. So here it's interesting, Rob, to see the money coming in on Austin Peay when Murray State seems like the better team here.
Yeah, and Austin Peay was the team heading into this, Matt, the team that had fall games, the team that had higher expectations. I remember, again, I'll go back to our very first show here where a couple of Murray State insiders thought that this might be as underrated a team as there was in the Ohio Valley. And certainly that's proven to be true based on the 5-0 record. But you're right. Last week's win, it's a big win to beat Jacksonville State. 13-10 with a +5 turnover margin. You'd expect the margin of victory to be a little bigger than just a field goal when you're +5. But Austin Peay had trouble against the Jacksonville State defense, which everybody has so far this season. Austin Peay averages 2.9 yards per play last week. 14 possessions, 12 of those 14 went for 31 yards or less. On the other side of the coin, Jacksonville State, an offense that has been predicated on their running game for the majority of this season. The ground game has paved the way for the passing game, and it's been a pretty good balance. But they get a 65-yard touchdown drive right off the bat, and then those next 12 drives are 2 fumbles, 4 interceptions, 4 punts, a missed field goal, and a made field goal. They commit 18 penalties. So Austin Peay did their job, but they had an awful lot of things go their way as well to get that victory. I think if I'm just looking at keys to this game, Matt, for me, Murray State, as good as the 5-0 record looks, their offensive numbers just aren't real impressive at this point in time. It's a mediocre passing game. It's a team that really needs to be able to run the football in order to have any success through the air. And I think that might be the problem for them here because Austin Peay and Jacksonville State are the 2 top run defenses in this particular conference. And really, it's not close. Those 2 have been dominant in conference play against the run this season. And if Murray State can't run, and you add into that the fact that Austin Peay leads this league in sacks. I think they've got 17 sacks, averaging 3.5 per game. You talked about how well Murray State has protected the quarterback. We're going to see how well they protect the quarterback in this instance against a really fierce pass rush. To me, last week's game probably builds a little confidence as the season ends. What's been somewhat of a disappointing season for Austin Peay, obviously, but the springboard of confidence into the fall would be, I think, pretty well accepted by this team at this point in time. I'm going to say that they cover this number and win this game. They had that quarterback switch in the fall. We were looking at Jeremiah Oatsvall at quarterback. That switch for Austin Peay hasn't gone real smooth to Draylon Ellis, but they're still able to run it pretty well. And they put up a lot of points prior to last week's game. In 4 games prior to last week, they had scored 33 per contest. I think Austin Peay's the right side here. I agree with the line move. I think Murray State's undefeated record goes away this week.
All right, and game number 3, which is a 4 o'clock game. We had to get an offensive game in here, a game that's going to have a total in the 60s. And, of course, this game's going to have a lot of points. Eastern Washington at UC Davis. This one opened UC Davis -3.5, total 69. It has come down a little bit. Total's now 67.5. There's a couple of 68s, courtesy of the WagerTalk live odds page. Check them out at WagerTalk.com. And UC Davis went from a 3.5-point favorite down to a 2-point favorite. There's a 1.5 at William Hill. There's a 1 at Bookmaker. Don't know if that's still there if you want to take advantage of that. But a couple of numbers here. You look at Eastern Washington, 3-1. They've won 3 straight games since that opening loss to Idaho. They won 45-13, 46-42, 62-10. They scored 21 points in the first 6 minutes and outgained Cal Poly 683 to 238 offensively. They're averaging 578 yards of offense, which ranks 2nd in the FCS. They're 3rd in passing, 5th in scoring offense. And then you look at UC Davis. They're 3-1 so far. They're coming off a 31-27 win against Idaho State, and they're a defensive bunch, 318 yards. They lead the Big Sky. They also lead in rushing offense and passing defense. So your classic case of a really good, really potent offense against a defense that can play pretty well here, Rob. What do you think?
Yeah, the contrast is right there, Matt. It's stark as could be what these teams want to do to be successful or what they have to do to be successful. Let's just start with the last 2 weeks, each of these teams facing Cal Poly, a team that we learned after the Eastern Washington game was just ridden with COVID. It's even amazing that they attempted to play the Eastern Washington game, but the week before they got drilled for 73 points by Cal Davis, so shorthanded. I think they were down to like 49 players, and then they decided to just call the season quits after the Eastern Washington game because the situation had gotten so bad inside that team. So those last two wins, those two wins for both of these teams, the high production, I think we have to put a little asterisk next to, because the other team, while they were overmatched, they were severely overmatched because of the coronavirus circumstances. The schedules with these two, Matt, have been eerily similar. The schedule maker has these two kind of on the same path. As I mentioned, they both destroyed Cal Poly under bad circumstances. They both had close calls with Idaho State. EWU wins it in a different fashion, 46-42, but Tyler Vanderwall, ex-Wyoming quarterback, played real well there and played pretty good last week against Cal Davis, a game where they get the game-winning touchdown inside the last 10 seconds to survive and stay alive in the top 10 rankings and in a spot for the playoff here. Aside from that, the biggest difference to me, by the way, they both played Idaho and Paul Petrino as their first game of the season. Remember, EWU got upset by Idaho, and Cal Davis came in and beat them 27-17. But the biggest difference here is that, to me, Cal Davis played Weber State, which is the class of the conference, had a 13-0 halftime lead, lose the game 18-13, but no shame in doing that. They held that offense to 18 points. And you laid out pretty well in the intro what this game is going to be. Eric Berrier and that passing offense, which, to start the season had a bunch of young receivers, and now that receiving crew has grown together, receiving core, and they're throwing the ball all over the lot, but they're going to want to throw it against a Cal Davis team that plays the pass really well, that can get to the quarterback. We'll see if they can succeed. On the other side, it's ball control out of Cal Davis and Dan Hawkins. You mentioned it. They can run it real well. To me, I totally agree with the line move here from 69 down to 67.5. This really doesn't qualify, in my mind, as one of those Southland Conference barn burners that gets listed at 67.5 and we just see up and down. I think Eastern Washington, which hasn't played a ton of good defenses this season, right? I mean, they have not faced Weber State, and when they did face Idaho, they were kind of stymied offensively. I think that they can be contained a little bit here. I think Cal Davis will be content to control the clock, and obviously EWU will stack the box and dare them to throw it a little bit. They haven't been that successful throwing the ball. Cal Davis hasn't. Hunter Rodriguez, first-year quarterback, hasn't been great. To me, this thing should stay under. I agree with it coming down to 67.5, and I think that's the way it'll be played. Somewhere in the 20s, maybe a 27-24 type game, but I don't think it'll get anywhere near this number.
All right, so this is the last look segment, and Rob, is there a game that you want to put people on here?
As far as look, I think it's important to look at the game we just talked about, Matt. That Eastern Washington Cal Davis game is important for both sides. A second loss, I think, plummets them down in the FCS rankings and toward the bottom of the playoff standing. So to me, it's the most important game of the week. I think it's the most fascinating game of the week because of the matchup. Since we don't have North Dakota State and South Dakota State, I think that's the one that I would be looking on. As far as putting anybody on something from betting terms, I'm going to wait until later on this afternoon. I'll start to release, maybe even into tomorrow morning, release my FCS plays.
Make sure to check him out on WagerTalk.com. The one game I'll say for everybody is New Hampshire finally returning to the field after almost a month off. They've had one game under their belt. They're taking on Rhode Island, a Rams team that had those 2 wins on the road in overtime. They come home and lose to Delaware. Rhode Island flips from an underdog to a favorite. Of course, we don't know who's going to be available for New Hampshire, so that's something to certainly watch as we go closer to that 1 o'clock kickoff on Saturday. Make sure to check out Rob's stuff on WagerTalk.com. He's got all sorts of things covered, whether it's the Final Four, the FCS, NBA, all that good stuff. Make sure to check him out on WagerTalk. I am on Sports Memo, whether it's NBA props or if it's the Final Four, baseball, whatever it is. Always something to check out on our pages, Sports Memo and WagerTalk.com. Getting close to the playoffs. For Rob Veno of WagerTalk.com, I'm Matt Joseph, SportsMemo.com. See you again next week.